Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This episode I know very critical, but we have our world famous scholar, and they are from industries. Already I get a very good feedback about our open dialogues and our involvement with developing worlds. So we will discuss on that particular issues. We have our Professor David Smith and we have Professor Rob. So I want to start from Professor David Smith, how you want to analyze this topic, and especially this is little bit of unclear for many of our students. And students mean there are many corporate and government people, they are working with us. They believe that you can give, both of you can give actually uh, better analysis and some good example.
Well, Sri, Neuromorphic computing, as you begin to look at it and begin to go through the process, is really an approach where elements of a computer are modeled after systems in the human brain and in the human body. Um, my preferred way to really look at this is I call biological computing. And a number of years ago, I did uh, one of the first forecasts in this area for one of the United States government agencies that is driven very heavy by computing and very heavy by the application of computing. And what's very interesting about this is that this trend towards this anamorphic really started back in the late 1980s. With a guy named Mead, who was really one of the leaders of beginning to do things which were brain like in the ability to learn and adapt. And a lot of work was being done on this in research institutions. But about 2006 is when you saw uh, the activity of anamorphic computing begin to move from research institutions into practical applications. One of the universities in the United States, Georgia Tech, was one of the leaders of beginning to push this over into the more the commercial uh, marketplace. Some of the early applications of this were called uh, field programmable neural networks of different types. Uh, and you begin to see chips developed around it based on neurons being used as part of the turning point of it. There a ton of work done in it, a lot of it pretty well still in the academic domain. But we're beginning to see a neuromorphic sensing ecosystem begin to evolve with some of the big players going into it. Uh, IBM, particularly in IBM government systems, has been a very active player in this for decades. You see others and chip companies like Intel, Micron jumping into it. You see companies like Samsung and others beginning to uh, more fully embrace the vision of this type of approach to biological computing. Um, One of the very interesting things is you look at it is the approaches you see in neuromorphic computing complement where we see we're going in the other high powered computing architectural with quantum based computing. Quantum based is really more of let me do very, very fast number crunching. And using the quantum effects, it's very good at that. Uh, there's just been an announcement by IBM of a very large uh, quantum computer in the last few weeks, and uh, China has released two quantum computers that are of massive scale right now. But where quantum computers are good at crunching numbers, where where nanomorphological biological computing excels is doing things in parallel. think of your human body. We don't process one thing at a time. I don't look at the screen and just process you by itself. We process stuff all around us. We're constantly sensing, bringing that in, understanding it. And it's not all necessarily at the forefront of our minds. Well, that's how this whole process of neomorphism happens. Is it's more parallel. Things are done in more of a matrix type of approach versus more of a linear approach. But I think that's a good way to get in and let Rob put his insight onto it.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what insight you want to add?
Okay, so let's be clear on the term. It's neomorphic computing. The neomorphic computing was created to mimic the human brain. You have artificial neurons that cascade as they try to reach a decision. The problem with neomorphic computing is if you're going to try to emulate something, you need to understand deeply the thing that you're going to emulate. And we really don't understand the brain well enough to emulate it. The recent research out of neuroscience indicates the brain isn't what we thought it was, a computer. It's an interface. It interfaces the human experience with the real world. And it's very dependent on other elements in the body. In fact, originally we thought the brain controlled things like heart rate, beat, and breathing. Turns out it doesn't. That's distributed. Those commands are distributed. So the process we're taking to develop artificial intelligence by emulating the human brain is at its core flawed. I would also argue that taking a biological construct like a human and using it as the bar for artificial intelligence is probably not wise as well, because we're not that great at reaching decisions. Yes, we can infer things from a set of data, but often the thing we infer has really nothing to do with the real world. I mean, just look at the mess we have around us in terms of political decision making. The stronger path right now to artificial intelligence is a term called deep learning. It followed machine learning, which was programmed intelligence. And deep learning is one where the AI trains itself over time. And when you're able to train an AI at machine speed, so constructing or organizing a set of lessons that might take a human years, if not decades, to learn. A computer can teach itself that in minutes. And more important, once a computer is taught, it can then infer a set of processes. If that teaching process is electronically transferred to another computer, a less powerful one. So we start with direct learning, DL, and then we create the teaching set, and then we take that teaching set and apply it to less powerful computers, who then act in much the same way through inference. And so that is right now the better process than neomorphic computing, because neomorphic computing is based on a flawed concept, the concept that the brain is the computer that you want to emulate, and that humans are the single thing that is intelligent. We do define the world from ourselves, but that's not necessarily true either. Recently, we found out that, for instance, slime mold is intelligent. Doesn't have a brain. The way they were able to figure that out is a slime mold will learn the fastest path to a piece of food and where the food is, and it will. And it does that without a central processing unit, without a brain. It reminds me a lot of the early days when I was working for IBM in their telecom division, and we'd get executives from IBM, and they'd come in and say, "Well, how fast is your processor?" And we'd kind of shake our head. Well, this is telecom. It really doesn't matter. This isn't a computer as you think about a computer. This is a networking system. And really, you're talking about data throughput, and you can do distributed processing to solve the problem. You don't have to centralize it. But that disconnect is what made it so that AT&T and NCR didn't work together, and IBM and Rome Systems, which is where I was from, didn't work together. So it's a failed concept at its heart. So neomorphic computing does have some benefits, however. like anything else, we're creating with the metaverse this idea of digital twins. And at some point, we are going to be creating digital twins of humans. More important, as we analyze things like mental illness, then being able to emulate critical parts of the human body that, and the brain clearly is connected to mental illness, could help us understand better how to either wed humans and machines so we could offset using something other than drugs, a mental condition that's chronic. It could also allow us to better understand how the body works, because we can better model it using what we know about the different organs. But right now, it doesn't seem to be the fast path to artificial intelligence. Deep learning, I think I said direct learning earlier. Deep learning looks like deep learning is the fast path to artificial intelligence, and this idea of a general purpose artificial intelligent machine. And before I leave you, there's this entire concept of artificial intelligence, I think is self-limiting. We don't have artificial strength, we don't have artificial sight, we don't have artificial touch. The things we're developing in those areas will emulate, smell, touch, sight, and it's binary. You either can see or you can't. This concept of artificial intelligence is meaningless. Something is either smart or it's not smart. And I think that initial delineation, calling machine intelligence, which is really what we're talking about here, artificial, is a mistake. We should have a stronger concept of what really constitutes intelligence, and that's what we should be building towards. So that's it. Neuromorphic computing was an interesting idea, but it's based on a failed concept of the brain being a computer. And while it has value in human modeling and healthcare, it is not the proper path to be on for artificial intelligence. Deep learning is proving to be a much better way to develop machines that can think for themselves. And it goes to the core of things like autonomous vehicles and robots and some of the most advanced technologies we're developing in this area.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, yes, we can understand there are some difficulties and some challenges, but besides that, do you believe that is there any future opportunity for neuromorphic computing?
Well, actually, I do, because you particularly have to break neuromorphic computing down into its domain. There's a hardware domain, particularly built around chips and elements like that. There is a software domain where software is being designed and developed that way. There's a whole architecture science built around this as well. I agree that deep learning is a very important part of what artificial intelligence is. I was on a call yesterday just trying to discuss how do we do deep learning among concepts which branch into the mental health domain, like social emotional learning, because you've got to train the systems for them to be able to respond well in places like that. Where I see this going forward is some of the new enhancements in chip technology that have Intel, IBM, the Brain Project have all designed new chips which are neuromorphic in there. The one that's really fascinating to me is one called Brain Scales. And on the chipset itself, it has synapse arrays, it has neuron arrays, it has very, very fast analog to digital converters. It has analog interfaces. It has an analog parametric memory in it. And what's interesting is most of the chips we have today, particularly the Van Neumann architecture chips, really are connected in the digital world. And where neuromorphic design comes in is more of a connection with the analog world as well. And that, in fact, it goes back, finally, one of the first computers out there, Babbage's Loom, Babbage was so believed that there's a correlation between the complex patterns of the human body and the computational things he was developing, that when he died, he had instructed that half of his brain be given to scientists to study how it could be used in a computational activity. So even back in those early days, you saw people fascinated with where this is going. Um, a couple of other interesting things is uh, recently, one of our national labs, senior scientist in this area at Oak Ridge, really came out on it and says, really, the neuromorphic architecture is literally made up of neurons and synapse, and that there's a lot of work going on how to put these systems together. This particular one, she presented at a conference last year. And so you're seeing that there's a lot of research going on in this area, and it's really beginning to see some differences. But the big approach is that this is a parallel approach. Uh, there is a lot of projects from projects such as called Spinnaker. You have projects called Brain Scales. Uh, Intel has a very interesting one uh, called LOIHI, LOIHI, and it is using 14 nanometric lithography to develop these neuromorphic chips that they're beginning to deploy and do. Even IBM has a project today in this area called True North. And True North is an approach to begin to use this applied to a broader set of data and data science to begin to do application. Is it ready for prime time? Not ready for prime time today, except in very, very specialized applications. So it's still maturity level has a way to go. But to me, it's a very, very interesting concept because just like we have about 15 different types of databases that we are going to use for different types of data, it makes sense to me to have different computer architectures to use to be able to do different types of computation on the problem sets we're trying to solve.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Like regarding neuromorphic processor, like if you give us some idea about this processor. Yeah.
Well, so one of the other problems with neuromorphic computing is in emulating the human brain, we have 100 billion neurons. The largest processor is about 100 million, a magnitude below transistors. So we're not even the scale that we need to be to make this thing work. It's kind of the same problem we've got with quantum computing, where we have to have a massive number of qubits to make a quantum computer viable, and we're well below that critical mass in terms of capability. Advancing far more quickly now, but we're not at the threshold we need to do anything other than emulate. We can do a pretty good job of emulating a quantum computer, but we're not able to quite yet put one into production. And the time that we'll be able to do that, it's a moving target. As I said, with neuromorphic computer, you're talking about more of an analog, or David pointed this out, I think, that we're talking about more of an analog computing process than a digital computing process, so less binary and more fluid in how it reaches decisions. And as we talk about the brain being an interface between the world and our mind, the neuromorphic computer could evolve into being a better interface between the world and the digital technology that we've developed, that we are developing for our current range of deep learning artificial intelligence machines. I'm not really seeing it play out that way, but it's an area that we, of course, are exploring. The difficulty remains that we just don't have a really good idea of the role the brain and body play in decision making yet. We have a lot of theories, but those theories are relatively fluid, and that makes it very hard for us to emulate something that we don't quite fully understand yet, and that's where it's problematic in terms of approach. We do understand how to create a digital computer, and clearly we've been doing that for decades. But creating one that fully emulates the human brain has simply proven problematic. So the best place for this will undoubtedly be as we develop digital twins of humans and explore digital immortality, and we're going to try to fully emulate somebody at a relatively fine level. Neuromorphic computing will probably be critical for that path, and it is a path that's got a lot of interest at the moment. If you want to understand something, you do have to fully replicate it, and neuromorphic computing will be critical to creating a true digital twin of ourselves. Granted, it's probably not going to be us, but it may fool third parties into thinking that it is, and provide us with a way to capture the intelligence and capability of someone, either through generations, so you can look back at your ancestors, or as we explore space, it's going to undoubtedly be easier for us to send an intelligent machine into space than it is going to be to send humans. Our life expectancy is relatively low for space travel, and we're relatively fragile for it as well. So being able to send something that is the equivalent of us in terms of thinking capability would go a long way into being able to explore distant planets and particularly other solar systems.
Thank you. Mr. Markley, we are discussing about neuromorphic computing. So what you want to add today?
We're actually out of my level of expertise, but being the journalist, I always have interesting ideas and interesting thoughts. To both Rob and David, it's my understanding, and like I said, science wasn't necessarily one of my strong suits in college, but it is my understanding that we don't even use but a small percentage of our brain power as individuals and things of that nature. I think I've heard several friends of mine, including some in the science field, that say that we are lucky if we use 10% of our capacity of our brains, and that's even for the most genius of the folks out there, that they are using maybe that much, and some of us maybe even using far less. So it does seem like a lot of our brain we're not even using on a regular basis. And the other thing that I've heard, which might be more of an ethical question, but I don't know what people's thoughts are, to both David and Rob in this regards, is I know that a lot of times we want to be able to keep our memories alive, even if we can't stay alive ourselves. As I told Sharif, and I've told several other friends of mine on different platforms, I'm personally going for 200, even though I'm not doing anything to actually do that, because I'm not exercising, I'm not actually doing all the things that they say you're supposed to do for a longer life and all of that. But if you've watched the history channels, or if you watch some of the news channels, some of those people that are 100 years old and everything, they're drinking, they're doing all kinds of other stuff well past the time that they probably should be, and sometimes they're still making it to 110, 115, whatever. So I don't know how much of that has to do with mindset than anything else. So I figured if I've got a mindset that I'm going to go for 200, maybe I'll make it to at least half of that. At least I'm going to go with the mindset, philosophy, and all of that. What's the old saying? You set a big goal and you didn't make it. If I make it to Heaven's Gate, all I can say is that, hey, I set the goal. I didn't quite get there, but at least it was a good goal. But from an ethical standpoint, and I guess I'll get to the question, is how do you feel about this? Because I do know a lot of times we want to be able to, as you were just saying, Rob, carry some of our memories up. I mean, they're our ancestors. We would love to know what their mindset was, why they did some of the things that they did, whether it was treacherous or whether it was noble things. Because I'm sure people would love to know about what was going through Albert Einstein's mind, or what was going through even Hitler's mind, if we want to go on the treacherous side and all of that. And then, of course, we would love to be able to carry our memories beyond, even just for personal levels. Like I've said, I'm sure that, after I'm gone, if my nephews are still here and the earth is still here, they might like to have memories of their Uncle Mark and some of the eccentric questions that he asked the panelists whenever he came on to these kind of things and things of that nature. So I guess the question is, how much of this digital neuro stuff will be able to keep our memories alive and all of that. And like I said, I do know that I'm speaking outside of my expertise, but as a common man, I think that that's some questions that some folks would love to know.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, you are working as a CTO. My question is that, uh, example, when the corporation like IBM or Microsoft, or these are the large corporations, even your corporations, when they go for new product innovations, so how does it works? How you make plan or go for fresh research, or how you innovate the new things? So, yeah. Unmute, please.
Research in this area, I think, is happening in multiple colleges within the universities in multiple areas. The domains on this are interesting. Let me start at the low level on the answer to your question, though. I oftentimes, because many of the parents I know that I am a futurist, they ask me, what do we need to do with our kids when they go to college and stuff? And one of the things I tell them is make sure they at least have some basic biology courses, because this type of process is going to be important going forward. And it's going to be not just in the chips and stuff, but even in the way software is approached and how we look at complex system problems. Because part of the way of looking at chaos theory and complex systems problems evolves many times back to a biological approach. And so you see that going forward. Also, the nanomorphic computing and processing really takes yourself back to more of a multidisciplinary approach. So you're having to work across domains, engineering, biological, computer science. Even as Mark says, you get into some philosophy with it and the different elements like that. A lot of nanomorphic processing depends on sensors and actuators and things to be able to work with it. So again, it's a very broad academic discipline that can begin to work on this whole approach.
Thank you. Professor Rob, if you share your experience, like industrial experience, especially we are observing that many innovation happening, US corporation, especially US corporation doing this kind of innovation. So how does it work?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not in production yet. The underlying concepts are still in flux, as I mentioned, and David's correct. This is a cross-discipline development effort. Because our understanding of the brain is biological in nature, and of course, the practice of understanding the brain, at least how it works, is psychology. We don't have a lot of psychologists that are also data scientists, and so we lack the bridge skills for the people that are creating the neuromorphic computers with the psychological skills of the folks that are understanding the brain. And as I mentioned before, that brain understanding, it falls well short of where it probably needs to be if you're going to create a digital twin, if you're going to create a duplicate of it. We're looking at it because there's a huge focus on artificial intelligence. This idea that we want planes, trains, and automobiles that no longer have people in them. We want factories that they don't have people in them. I would point out, though, in an emerging economy, part of the role of government is to ensure employment, because unemployed people are a problem populace that won't be under control and clearly won't be particularly happy. And unhappy populaces don't do great things for their leadership. Things tend to end badly. This particular aspect of it, given the intellectual property that exists in some of these countries, isn't where it needs to be to develop it. And given that the technology would be used to do something that might be counter-strategic, I mean, replacing people rather than augmenting them, I'm not convinced this is a great area for an emerging economy to play around in. This is really something in a place where, like here, where we have tons of jobs at the moment, where we don't have people to fill them, and our policies are making it very difficult to bring people in from outside. So here, moving to automation is critical. Now, the other area to driving automation, of course, is the idea of the pandemic. Being able to prevent people from going into places that are unhealthy for them. Healthcare, mining are two areas where people are relatively high risk and might be better handled with intelligent computers, with autonomous machines that can go in and do the job without people being involved. Then if you have a mine collapse, you just dig out the machines. You're not digging out dead bodies. And same thing with healthcare. As we found during the pandemic, health institutions become overwhelmed. Healthcare workers get sick, which exacerbates the problem because you don't have the people to take care of the people that are getting sick because they're getting sick as well. And in those cases, you might want to use a neuromorphic approach to the AI to give it more of an analog feel. And healthcare in and of itself tends not to be binary. It tends to be more of an analog practice, in that you get a lot of variance between the elements. You can get COVID and not really be sick. You can also get COVID and end up on a ventilator and die. So it's not binary. It's not if you get sick, then you will die, or if you get sick, nothing really happens. It follows a realm of outcomes that analog computers are probably better in dealing with than binary computers long term. So neuromorphic computing is a way to bridge the digital with the physical. That aspect of the human brain is relatively well thought through, and there's probably where it's going to play the most. But as I say, in an emerging economy, replacing people is probably not your number one priority. Finding a way to get people to work with machines is, and you could argue that neuromorphic computing will allow us to create better man-machine interfaces. We are going down a path of what we call the singularity, which is a digital explosion that pretty much overwhelms everybody else, and where man will have to either fit in with that digital or analog future or become extinct. And so with an awful lot of leading scientists now arguing that it's the extinct path, it looks like it's going to be the most likely, which is problematic for a whole number of reasons if you want the race to survive. So neuromorphic computing could be the way we better interface people and machines long term, and allow us to have what many companies have been promising, this idea of a true digital assistant, one that is more companion than front end for a search engine, which is what we largely have now. And this could very well be on that path.
Thank you. Mr. Markley.
Couple of things that I was thinking about as they were saying that. One, it sounds like we're heading toward Astro the dog, if you remember any of those old TV shows and things of that nature, because it was like you didn't actually have the pet, if I remember the Jetsons correctly. It was
you mean Rastro? You mean Rastro?
Rastro, right? Rastro, right? Rastro, the robotic dog that was in there and everything. And I remember that show vaguely and everything, but I do remember that was part of the dialogue. The other thing that I've heard people talking about, and I don't know what my two fellow panelists' thoughts or even your thoughts are, Sharif, is that sometimes people have been concerned, and I'm not saying it has to be a legitimate concern, but even during this whole pandemic, and you mentioned the pandemic earlier, we've heard people that were concerned about us becoming too interfaced with our computers, for lack of a better term. And there was some concern about whether we might, and like I said, I know we don't even use all of our brain power. We don't use a significant amount of it, but there is, I guess, a feel that we might lose some of what we all pride ourselves on, whether you're religious, spiritual, whatever, which is free will. Because if we're tied to a computer, then maybe the computer has more control over us than we have over ourselves. So I know that there was, all kinds of theories. I'm not saying that I bought any of them because I did get my vaccine, but there are all kinds of theories about what was going into the vaccine and whether that was playing into this kind of mind control kind of element and things of that nature. But I was just wondering, for those that are concerned about us becoming too interface with the computer world, and I do know that whenever there's a change, like we went from agricultural to industrial, and now industrial to technological, and maybe this is like technological to AI, we'll just call it that. And I don't know whether there's a new name for this and everything, but there's always this kind of job creations or new ages, and every new age, something happens that the jobs aren't as popular. Like we lost some industries when we went from agricultural to industrial, And the same can be said for some of these other transitions. So I do know that jobs are lost whenever we make these advances. But, and I brought up before, there is concern in our population about whether some of these jobs are going to be able to survive, and if not, how we can adapt to them. And not everybody, you know, if you're older, you might not be able to get into some of the advanced biology and things of that nature. So I do agree that I'm going to make sure that my nephews are learning biology and that they've got biology courses because they're 12 and 13. So they're at a good age to learn these kind of things. But, you know, so those of us in the middle age, not as much. So any thoughts from my fellow panelists?
Sorry, what was your question specifically?
The whole concept of whether this analog, whether this concept of us being tied in more to our computers is a concern for those that are feeling that we might lose our own free will. I guess that's the quickest way to put the question.
It's a valid concern. I mean, what we're looking at is creating a computer infrastructure where computers are trained instantaneously or near instantaneously from information that was derived at another computer. A training computer creates the information, then it goes to an inference computer, which practices it at scale. And we're using those same concepts as we approach how to better build or combine people with technology. So there is a chance, as Musk and others develop their brain interface, that we'll be able to, on the good side, make up for brain diseases, be able to correct, say, Alzheimer's disease by providing an external memory source that would provide us the ability to still remember things even when our mind ceases to. The danger, of course, with any data construct is what happens if somebody compromises the data that's being fed into people en masse. This idea of mass brain control could be problematic, and we've certainly seen it play out to some degree in social media, where people are driven to views that are not in their best interest by folks that are constructing false stories that cause them to think the world is very different than what it is. And of course, that speaks directly to, say, the anti-vax movement, which is largely built on a set of constructs that are false. And that's before we're doing direct transfer of information. This is happening pretty much in front of our eyes as it goes, and our ability to stop it has proven to be less than effective. So as we move into these brain interfaces, the chance for somebody to abuse this information, and that's one of the big complaints about Facebook going into the metaverse, is they may create what is basically a false dialectic and train a whole bunch of people to be nothing other than consumers of crap, and which wouldn't do anybody any good. The questioning their ethics. So the ethical approach to these new systems becomes critical, and providing some kind of consistent oversight to the process becomes critical. But government has proven to be relatively inconsistent and ineffective on this kind of a role. Government tends to be reactive as opposed to proactive. And when it attempts to be proactive, it often gets it wrong. And so the real difficulty, I think, that we've got going forward is, as we develop these constructs and as we move towards the singularity, is making sure we don't make things a ton worse at machine speeds than we have in the past. You can see the issues at scale with the arguments on global climate change, for instance, which should be relatively obvious in terms of at least focus and effort. Yet it is not. We are all over the map here, and some of the things we're doing to fix the problem are just shifting the problem from one area to another. For instance, going to electric cars works great unless your grid is powered by coal, and which it's not really. And some of the manufacturing processes that we're now using to speed up the creation of electric cars aren't very ecologically sound either. It's very much like we look at something that should be really good and we say, okay, let's not do the right way, let's do the fast way. And the fast way can do much more damage than it can do good. So an ethical one coming up with a consistent definition of what is ethical, and then an ethical construct that keeps people focused on what's best for the race, as opposed to what's fast or more financially lucrative, becomes a critical aspect of our path to the future, and one that is typically underfunded and understaffed. So there lies our deep problem. I do want to pick up a misnomer that came up earlier about us using only 10% of our brains. Current thinking is we use 100% of our brains. That was something that was exacerbated by the movie Lucy, which was a fun movie, but not really based on fact. And so this concept that somebody's going to be able to give us a pill or whatever, and suddenly we're going to be godlike creatures striding across the landscape with the ability to change space and time. Let's just say that was science fiction kind of getting ahead of itself, but it has no connection, at least from what we understand, and it is a fluid area. It has no connection to how our mind works or the capabilities of our bodies. If we're looking for superpowers, it's not there. So just be aware that there's a lot of misinformation floating around about how we function, and that misinformation is causing us to make decisions that are not in our best interest as well.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Professor David Smith. Thank you, Mr. Dan, joining for today's session. Professor David Smith.
Well, sorry, I have roofers who showed up earlier, and I now have air hammers on top of my roof and people above my head. I love the question that Jason just put up there, and some of the new research going on, particularly inside Intel, is really pushing that way. Today, you see networks being converted from what's called DNNs, or deep neural networks, and they're beginning to use more of the neuromorphic chip. And it's being used to directly train the networks, which are created by the neuromorphic processor itself. Part of the research being done at Intel on that is something that they're calling backpropagation, which is a way to help deep learning begin to go forward with it. The Intel chip I mentioned earlier is a 2 billion transistor type chip, which is asynchronous neuromorphic mesh in it, which has many different architectures which are moving it forward. You're at the place where you're beginning to see a perfect storm, though, and the different types of processors that are being deployed and being able to adapt the various parts to them. There is a type of processor that's called a morphologic processor, where it can rearrange itself and assign itself in different states. That's a different type of processor that can work in the same domain added to it. So as you heard Rob talking about the complexity of the system, and Dan a little bit too, this is another place where that systems of systems concept comes back in, and beginning to use the different systems for the right application of doing it. Here in Austin at the University of Texas Supercomputer Center, which has some of the fastest academic computers in the world, what they've done is real interesting. Is they have 4 different types of supercomputers there, and actually a quantum computing going in there as we're speaking, and they're networking these together to be able to switch between supercomputing type nodes to solve the more complex problems. I think you're going to see more of this type of hybrid processor-centric computing going forward in the future, and I think we'll see a lot more of that.
Mr. Dan.
Oh, hi. Thanks again for the great topic. Yeah, I really think a lot of our governments are behind the curve on looking at these issues. It was just recently that corporations created the Office of Chief Sustainability Officer. I think we really need at this point Chief Singularity Officers, and it's the kinds of issues that the U.S. Transhumanist Party and people in the transhumanist movement are looking at. It's really bringing us to the fundamental questions of, what is the goal of evolution? We can see the history of DNA goes back about 4 billion years or so, and evolution seems to, I think, divide into 3 roles: indigenizer, colonizer, and exoevolution, which I see as we're on the threshold of becoming a cosmic species. And if we don't get these threats together that technology is presenting, like runaway superintelligence, having access to dangerous effectors, then we risk going extinct. And that the number one job of society should be the management of extinction level threats, which I don't see going on in very many government offices, which is one of the things that motivated me to keep running for city council here in Thousand Oaks, because I'm talking about these issues that are causing these existential threats. Now, I think it's important that we have backup grids, that we're not totally in a single point of failure mode for civilization, which we really are right now in a lot of ways. The electric grid is a single point of failure. If that went down, it would basically create major urban unrest fairly quickly, because the food would disappear from the shelves in short order, and the gas wouldn't work at the pumps, the water wouldn't be pumped. So becoming more resilient is incredibly important. We think that we're a single organism, but humans are actually a colony of trillions of coopetition related cells. That we are actually mostly bacteria and non-human DNA cells that we use to digest our food. So this is actually an allegory for what needs to happen on the greater level in society. Cities, for example, could begin to function like cells, sharing information between each other in very logical and sustainable ways. The biggest resource that's out of place is kind of the information resource right now. I was talking with a friend of mine last night who's in the local makerspace group, and he has an interesting product that's a desktop CO2 scavenger. Most people are constantly exhaling CO2, and actually CO2, if it's in the local atmosphere, it makes you sleepy. It causes health problems. So you could actually get a sensor for measuring the CO2. I think it's under $100. You can put together an Arduino-based CO2 sensor, and you will feel more alert if you have a lower parts per million level of CO2. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could integrate information like the CO2 level with a Fitbit? You could see, okay, today I was breathing this concentration of CO2, and here's what happened to my sleeping habits, or here's what happened to my behavior patterns, or my heart rate, all these things. Cities are going to have to act like metabolic sensory organisms. And it's either going to happen from the top down, which would be pretty bad. I think we can get it to happen from the bottom up in a way that's voluntary. I think actually most of the functions that we task government with that are being done in an imposed kind of way could be done in a voluntary way. We would see that there's profit and plus factors to be gained by changing our behavior. So I think, how does this relate to neuromorphic computing? Well, this is something we can use to coach ourselves and coach our cities with better and better computing power. And yeah, I don't think the brain is a simple, mass compilation of complex neurons, and that's the phenomenon of consciousness arises out of just this mass interconnectedness. I think we are probably in a sense in a panpsychic universe, that there's a field of consciousness that permeates everything, and that our brains are more like a filter or a reception area for that. I mean, that's getting out there into kind of spiritual topics, but it's still a great thing to study all these problems of consciousness. The binding problem, the grounding problem. It's just an amazing field, and you could hardly go wrong by studying it. And everything that we consider work now is probably going to be going away because a robot could do 90% of the things we call work, and we should be doing the human things in our life, the things that make us human. And in the process, we'll figure out how to maintain our humanity. So that's my take on that for now. Thanks again.
You're muted. Sharif, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. There are questions from audience, very basic question, but they have different interest. Professor Rob, why do we need neuromorphic computing for development purpose? And I think already you give answer, but if you have
my point right now, probably not. You don't. But it really kind of depends on what you're developing. If you're trying to create a blend of man-machine, a better human-machine interface, if you're trying to understand how people think, that's where neuromorphic computing actually has its strength. It attempts to emulate how people think. And as I pointed out, it's a tad flawed because the brain is the interface, not the computer that the human uses. But anyway, the neuromorphic computing requires a very deep understanding of both the biological elements it's attempting to emulate and the decision process it's attempting to create. And so it's a blended skill set. I should point out that since, and David correctly pointed out, a whole number of companies are developing neuromorphic chips. They don't have the density that they need to actually do the job yet, and lack some of the understanding that will be required, but that'll be developed. But it does require a bridge skill set, somebody that understands the brain, has both a medical and a scientific background to effectively work, and that skill set is both unique and could be incredibly valuable. As we move to this next generation, these bridge skill sets, people that are architects and have computer skills, lawyers and have computer skills, doctors and have computer skills, will be in high demand because we're creating an awful lot of bridge technologies at the moment, and we don't really have the skill sets in the market to make these things work. And so, were I in school now, I'd be trying to pick a couple of areas of focus to develop a bridge skill, because that bridge skill will undoubtedly be relatively rare and very lucrative when I finally come out of school and I'm looking for a job. Also, I'd make sure I was doing quite a bit in terms of internships to make sure that I understood what areas I needed to study, because medicine is a broad study area, as is computer science, and having an internship with a company that's developing in this area would help a great deal in how I constructed my path to the degree, to make sure that I had the courses that I needed to give me the foundations that I wanted to do the job. It doesn't do you much good if you've got a medical degree and a computer degree, but you haven't studied in the areas that are required to make the technology real. So a combination of 2 degrees, a bridge skill set done in conjunction with an internship to make sure that your education path is in line with what it is you're going to need at the back end, and then you can pretty much write your own ticket.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, there is another question, Mr. Jason. So if the brain is just an interface, what is it an interface to?
Well, the brain is a place where it is one of the core elements of the central nervous system. And the central nervous system is the internet of our bodies. And it links all the pieces together. And what I think is one of the better examples now of the brain's role in part of our body is how we actually see the cloud computing network changing. and how increasingly our cloud computing networks are going to edge of cloud computing, because they're wanting to put the processors closer to where the work is being done, closer to where the sensors are, and begin to do it there. Well, that's kind of what we're doing with the whole way of neuromorphic computing going and things, is that the brain is relationship to the central nervous system is, as Rob said earlier, a lot of the processing, a lot of the control things are done distributed throughout our body, much like edge of cloud computing is pushing a lot of those decisions and things distributed throughout the cloud. So there's some real analogies there between the ones who do it. What you hear most, though, is you hear the term neuromorphic-like, biological-like, brain-like processing. It's not a one-for-one interface there. A lot of the processing in our body is actually chemical-based processing as well, and not electronic-based processing. So when you get into the physiology of the human body, a lot of things go into how we make decisions, how do we react, how do we do those. You know, it's just like a shot of adrenaline will speed up our processors, speed up our muscles, give us more strength. Same type of thing as you look at this. And this is why it's a whole system of systems. But, you know, the question that was asked, how far back does this go? The roots of it really go back to the beginning of computing, like I had said earlier. The person Charles Babbage, who created Babbage Loom, which was the first analog computer, not a digital computer, but an analog computer, actually donated half of his brain because he thought this neuromorphic type, this brain interface type of computing was going to be important in the long run. So it actually, to answer her question, it goes back to the very root of the whole concept of computing.
Thank you. Mr. Dan, there is another questions from...
Yeah, I think I can jump in on that question. Again, you know, individual organisms have a will of self-preservation, but we don't see the same kind of self-preservation instinct in society at large. So that's what we need to do, is grow a self-preservation nervous system for society at large. And I, you know, hate to keep harping on it, but, you know, becoming a multiplanetary species is going to be huge. You know, just ask the dinosaurs if you can't find them because they went extinct, because they, you know, the Earth is a cradle planet, and you can't stay in the cradle forever. You know, I mean, if you look at the phenomenon of a chick growing inside of an egg, the chick is like, oh my God, we're running out of resources. There's this wall, and I'm getting bigger, and things are closing in. But then what happens? The chick breaks out through the shell and realizes there's this whole extra universe of resources. And, you know, that is really I see the existential challenge is getting access to becoming a solar system capable species. And we might lose that now with the Kessler effect of collisions that are happening in the orbital sphere. You know, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, they just tested a satellite laser weapon, and it created a huge cloud of extra debris. You know, we might actually get to the point where we're going to need a curtain of aerogel that is the only safe window to launch through. You know, that can absorb impacts from runaway collisions. You know, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke said we might have a ring like Saturn of like loose flotsam and jetsam. That there's already so many pieces of debris in space. But yeah, I think this is an existential level issue, and neuromorphic computing is the nervous system that's going to create the information capability to tackle this big existential problem.
You're muted again.
Thank you. This is really great session, and especially this will be very helpful for our audience because these are the critical subjects. Some point in the society, in even academy, there are many misconceptions in developing world. So thank you, honorable speaker, Mr. Rob, Mr. David Smith, Mr. Dan, for your support for World Talent Economy Forum, because this is the way that we can learn and we can grow. So even this is the motto of World Talent Economy Forum, that learn, grow, and conquer. So thank you. This is really great sessions, and I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible with your government, with your academy, with your corporation. And we have many good news, like in December 1 to 3, we are developing a very, very special show and summit on public-private partnership with Rwanda. We have our partner with governments, with different ambassadors, as well as different corporations. They will join. And even there is a good news today, actually. Japanese ambassador from Rwanda, he confirmed that he will join as a speakers. His name is, because I just need to check his name, because he's definitely an honorable person, and his name is, just a moment. Oh yes, Masahiro Imai. He's a Japanese ambassador for Rwanda and Burundi, and he will join as a speakers. And all of our speakers, those who continuously support World Talent Economy Forum, we will declare our name soon, because we are working with the Rwanda and Burundi government and our local partners. And hopefully these are the way we will minimize the gap in between developed and developing nations. And beside that, in January, we have another biggest summit with all of the Muslim world business organizations. And we today we are actually declares World Talent Economy Forum declare a commitment that we are developing ethical finance bond, and more or less we get the commitment around $1 billion commitments. And those who are really interested about Islamic finance and ethical finance, I am sure it will be very, very interesting summit for us. And our board of advisor, always they are available for our audience. Thank you for today's sessions, and especially I know that time, because of time difference, now is very tough time. But Mr. Rob, Mr. Dan, even Mr. David Smith always support World Talent Economy Forum. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. I want to start from Mr. Dan.
Well, I think the number one job of governments is health and safety, and the number one way to improve health and safety is through greater adaptive intelligence. There's little things like I was seeing last night in our makerspace discussion. There are headlights for cars that can actually light up the road better as you're going around a curve, or dim the headlights when there's a car coming. I mean, this is stuff that could save lives, routinely. Doing things like being able to have sensors in the sewage system to detect pathogen levels. I mean, we are really not taking a full advantage of the information universe, and the more wired and interconnected we get, the less likely we are to go extinct, which I think is the big health and safety question, not going extinct. And that should be the number one concern of governments. But unfortunately, doesn't seem to be on the government radar too much. But I'm hoping that cities can start sharing municipal resolutions in a machine language adaptive learning kind of way, and we'll see what happens. I see good things ahead. So thanks again for inviting me today.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what's your concluding remark? There is one question from audience, if you want, and Professor David Smith, you can respond. What is the career path of neuromorphic engineering?
Career path. Well, it's certainly not going to be linear. It's an area that it is drawing a certain amount of research and a certain amount of money. As I mentioned, and as we tried to answer before, the neuromorphic computing is based on the concept of a flawed concept of what the human brain does. And the question about what does the brain interface between, it interfaces between reality and the mind and the brain are not synonymous. They're different concepts. The brain is a physical organ. The mind is a more of a philosophical concept that talks about how we function as individuals, kind of the core of our humanity or our individual nature, and the brain is that interface. The mind is much, as we're discovering, is distributed, and we know that a lot of mental problems are actually caused by physical issues that happen other places in the body. That's why right now the science is changing from being brain focused to being more holistic in nature. But the career path for a neuromorphic engineer is likely going to be solidly focused in the area of artificial intelligence or medical understanding, the medical research, because you are creating a simulation. And by the way, one of the advantages in creating a simulation of a human is the ability to do simulations at machine speeds. Recognize that machine speeds can operate up to 10,000 times faster than linear speeds. And so, say if we were able to create a full-on electronic, I don't want to say digital because the construct would be analog, but a digital twin of a human, we could do things like medical research on that digital twin at machine speeds, and we could also do social engineering at machine speeds, which both creates a promise and a problem, because social engineering, like any tool, can be used for good or ill. It would be a very interesting course of study. It is one that would require, if you're going to make it a career, some type of a base of capability in country. Otherwise, you're going to have to go out of country to advance your career. We certainly see that all over the world. Certain areas of specialty, the research is being done in countries other than where the specialties are being developed, and that means you have to travel to those other countries and go to where the work is, and recognize that as a foreign participant, you may be at a disadvantage against the people that are native, either from a language standpoint or just from a socioeconomic standpoint. I bring that up because there was one of the women that helped create the RNA antiviruses here in the United States just tried to change jobs. She's from out of country, and her boss just unloaded on her, almost destroyed her career. And this would not have happened had she been a citizen. So do recognize there are some exposures to working in a foreign country that you need to consider if you're going to go down that particular path. I'm not saying don't do it, but understand the pool before you jump into it, and make sure that you have adequate protections, because in some countries, being a non-citizen relegates you to a lower form of protection and help. And if you don't understand that and understand how to mitigate it, you can find yourself in trouble, in career trouble. So to end all, the neuromorphic computing is one of our paths to a future where people and machines are more deeply involved with each other, but also recognize it's a path that could lead us to wonderful things in the future. It's also a path that could be used against us, and making sure it's the former and not the latter should be involving much more of us, I think, than it currently does.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks?
Rob, I loved your answer there. Let me give a slightly different answer. I went ahead and while Rob was talking, went into a system of one of my former clients who actually hires nanomorphic engineers and things. And I was looking underneath their education requirements, and to me, it's very interesting. They want someone who has a electrical engineering degree. They want someone who understands VLSI systems, neural networks. They would like computer science in part of their background. They actually would like at least a minor in biology. And the other thing that is interesting here is they make the point of saying math is extremely important, and that the number of math hours should be above the normal degree plan. So those are some of the type of things that this agency is looking for. And this agency actually has working nanomorphic computers that they deploy, they use every day to analyze pretty complex problems. So to me, you can see it's not your classical degree path. And part of it depends on whether you're wanting to go into the hardware side of nanomorphic, whether you want to go into the software side of it, or whether you want to be in the middle with the engineering approach to it. So those are kind of the three paths you see going forward. To me, I think nanomorphic, again, I love to use the term biological computing as opposed to just pure nanomorphic, because I think that's more applicable where we're going to be with this technology in 20 years. And we haven't really talked about market size and things with this. Just as a closing kind of remark to here, neuromorphic computing is expected to be about a $70 million market in 2024, and is expected to rise to about a $22 billion marketplace in 2034. And so you see that going. The drivers are very broad, like all of us have said, and going there. And the academic paths are fairly complex. But it's at the point now where if this is an interest area, you can build your career in it as part of the approach I've talked about before of lifelong learning. You don't need to be the expert in all these areas at one time as you're being birthed from a university. You can get basic skills and then go deeper into the skills as you progress through your career. And that's where we see many of the people inside companies like IBM, Intel, inside some of the larger users, inside the national labs where they're doing a lot of work in this area. They started out with degrees in physics or electrical engineering or computer science or biology, and then they're supplementing it to get the skills to be applicable in this area. And my advice is that's a great way to do it. My advice to an entrepreneur who wants to begin to exploit this as an advantage is to do the same thing. Start with what you know, add to it, and morph to it, because this is something that's going to use all the different systems. And last point on this, neuromorphic also includes analog computing, analog sensing, and you should not go into neuromorphic with a mindset it's all digital. Most of the world is analog. And that's one of the reasons why this approach is so attractive, is you don't need to transfer everything through an ADE converter into a digital format. So again, a lot of opportunities, and it's one that I think as it matures will have its place alongside classic computing, morphological computing, as well as quantum computing.
Excellent. Today's session definitely helpful for the youth community. They can learn how they can develop their careers. They can understand these different paths. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, and Mr. Dan for joining today's session. Bye-bye and take care.